So, as I said earlier, this is Alan Schimmel, Editor-in-Chief of DevOps.com, and thanks for joining today's webinar, which is how to deliver a PaaS experience on any hybrid cloud. I apologize if you're hearing some noise in the background. We are trying to, looks like you might have some background noise, and we'll try to quiet that down. Today's speakers, we're lucky to be joined from Morpheus, David Estes, VP of Engineering, and you can see Dave's Twitter handle there if you wanted to reach out to him, and Andrew Tennant, Director of Regional Sales, and Andrew is also, see his Twitter handle there. Andrew's going to handle a lot of the play-by-play here, and David, I think, is going to be doing color. So with that said, Andrew, let's hand it over to you.
All right, thanks so much. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Let's just dive right into this. So I want to begin by giving you a little background on where Morpheus came from. I think that's important as we talk about the nature of the solution overall, and it really plays into how it was architected and some of the design principles. So Morpheus is actually owned by Bertram Capital, which is a private equity firm out of the Bay Area. And Bertram's business model is to invest in low-tech and no-tech companies, infuse them with technology, and then obviously sell them and reap that investment. In the course of doing that, the team at Bertram, especially the technology team, Bertram Labs, encountered just about every variety of application, database, cloud, infrastructure, you name it, in the course of their travels through these various acquisitions. And as a result of that, they had to develop a very agnostic approach to solutions. So they saw these patterns repeating around a need for agility and need for very, very cloud agnostic, even form factor agnostic approaches, and by that I mean some of these companies were legacy, traditional bare metal applications. Some were doing things with virtual machines. Some were already on the way with containers. And I'll actually do a survey of the group here today on the call to see what you guys are all doing with respect to this. So a poll question is going to come out in a bit around that. But all of these needs really came down to one thing, and that was the development of a platform that was cloud agnostic, infrastructure agnostic, and really allowed the deployment of applications to be outside of the realm of any specific infrastructure. And Morpheus was born. So from my perspective, it was kind of by the nerds for the nerds, right? And if we have a bunch of nerds on the phone, I think we probably do. Hopefully you can appreciate that. Now, when it comes to modern web scale applications, right, there are lots of things out there to help provision. I think provisioning on its own is not really the issue. From our perspective, it's table stakes, and it's something that's critical. And it's something that we need to provide regardless of destination. So if I'm deploying, like I say, on Amazon or Azure, or even internally on my own OpenStack or VMware cloud, if you will, I want ideally to have a single interface, a single pane of glass with which to do that. So from a provisioning standpoint, that's obviously part and parcel. But right away, we need to have the ability to scale that and provide fault tolerance. We need the ability to back it up and recover that application and the components that make up that application. We really need some way of logging. If I have an N-tier application that's scaling horizontally, how do I possibly collate all the logs coming from these disparate entities into a cohesive place that I can then troubleshoot from a development standpoint or troubleshoot from a production issue standpoint? Likewise, monitoring. What does it mean for a modern, cloud-native N-tier application to be up? Is it? It's really a collaboration of all the constituent components that make up its overall availability and so forth. So how do we handle that? And again, we'll talk about that with respect to Morpheus. And then finally, from a lifecycle perspective, the ability to not only monitor but then decommission those applications once they're no longer in use. And the approach for Morpheus is not only beginning at the provisioning side, but all the way around the horn, all of the ops part of DevOps. I think their observation was, and I would agree that many DevOps tools out there kind of leave the ops TBD and figure it out on your own. So there's we've sort of put the ops into DevOps, truthfully. And we're doing this on any infrastructure or private or public cloud. So anything from OpenStack to bare metal servers to Amazon, Azure, SoftLayer, Google, you name it. And again, we're doing that through the use of those native APIs on each of those clouds and each of those infrastructural options. And in doing so, we're providing a single, sort of our own single API back to you. So you can write and deploy your applications across these variety of destinations, but you're only doing it through a straightforward interface through Morpheus. And we feel that takes you out of the business of having to customize and tweak and rethink as you deploy to specific cloud X or Y. And again, at the end of the day, we're talking about that modern, really that modern web scale application stack, that bring your own stack approach of any app, really any database, and laying that on top of any infrastructure or cloud. One of the things that's also unique to Morpheus is the amount of knowledge this team has around specific database structures, layouts, best practices, and those are encapsulated and built into the tool as well. So if you're deploying Mongo, the best practices around Mongo and sharding and everything else are going to be built into the deployment here, so you're able to enjoy those the lessons learned from the team and have a terrific experience there. So with that, given the technical audience here, I'm just going to actually turn around to a demonstration, and just to give you a high-level flow here, I'm going to show how we set up those resources, attach Morpheus, if you will, to those clouds. Morpheus itself is a software appliance, very lightweight, runs in the control plane only, so we're just going to sit above all of this the specific workload and really orchestrate and move things around. We're not interjecting ourselves into the code in any way or into the applications. And that from a deployment perspective is very quick to deploy. It's also very non-intrusive. If you decide to go a different direction down the road, you can remove Morpheus from the equation and just keep on trucking. There's no residual remediation required. And I think that's an empowering thing in this space, right, of agility. We don't want to trap you into a PaaS experience like many other tools inevitably do. Then we're going to, so I'll provision a database and an app server. We'll use Tomcat and MySQL. I'm going to be doing these as containers for speed, just so we can do it in the time we're sitting here on the webinar. I'll link them to form an app, and then we'll talk about monitoring and backups and scaling, and turn it back around for some Q&A at the end. All right, so I'm going to switch now to Morpheus. So I'm logged into the controller. There's full roles-based access in Morpheus, so depending on team and role and function, I can delineate what access individuals have to what resources, both on the compute side as well as even functional administrative access, if you will, to provision and create and configure things within the appliance itself. Right away, we're beginning here at the dashboard. So here I can see at a high level everything going on in my Morpheus environment. So I have 7 instances provisioned. Those would be instances of databases and web servers and such. From a monitoring perspective, I don't have any open incidents, but I could see that here at a high level, logging and backups. Again, these 3 categories on the right are embedded within Morpheus, and you get them as part of the platform. But we also integrate 2 many popular tools around each of these categories, monitoring, logging, and backups, and we'll see that here in a sec. I can have favorited instances down below, so I can quickly get to the stuff I want to look at. I can look at my overall availability and response time, look at logs, and look at recent activity from an audit perspective. To begin with, though, for Morpheus to be effective, what we're going to be doing is actually pointing it at some resources. And what I'm going to show you here is I selected a group, and again, you can have multiple groups. And then within those groups, you have multiple clouds. So from a cloud perspective, on the left, we see our public cloud integrations. So Azure DigitalOcean, Google, SoftLayer, vCloud Air, and Amazon. And all I'm going to do in each of these is simply populate it with my credentials. I can even inventory existing entities that are out there and bring them into the fold if I choose. I can have multiple integrations, multiple connections to, say, Amazon if you have different teams with different accounts, or I could have a master account, however you want to kind of connect that up. Then on the private cloud side, everything from the traditional hypervisors, Hyper-V, VMware, Xen, KVM. Nutanix and Cisco UCS are more hardware platforms. So this is actually doing part of the IaaS piece of things, where we're going to take a stack of equipment and turn it into a DevOps cloud from scratch, if you will. Even developer environments like VirtualBox and Fusion, so I can deploy as a target. My cloud could actually be on a developer's own laptop. That's an interesting use case that's quite helpful. In the case of VMware, we have both traditional VMware vSphere, and we also have ESXi, and both can be managed nicely that way. And then finally, we actually have OpenStack integration, both regular OpenStack and Metapod, which is Cisco's sort of managed version of OpenStack. Then finally, Morpheus itself is what we call a cloud. If you had absent any other option, if you will, the Morpheus cloud is really, I want to take a stack of servers and turn them into a place for workload. In this case, we'll deploy Ubuntu with KVM and Docker, and be able to deploy KVM VMs as well as containers. All right, so again, if we have questions, just feel free to save them for the end. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A. What I'm going to do now, though, is without diving into each of these, because we have somewhat shortened time, but this is where I would allocate load balancers, both hardware or software load balancers, point to those in my environment. Same thing with storage. Point out where my storage is for various things. Pixie boot, security groups, and other things are all available there on the infrastructure side. Let's jump into the meat of it, though, which is really on the app side and the instance side. So if I go to instances, you'll see what the instances I currently have running, and I've actually created part of my two-tier application already in the background here. My Tomcat server is already there. But when I add I'll add the MySQL backend here to show you. When I bring this up, this is a catalog now, pre-populated with all of the various common instance types that we see. And if there are some in here that you don't see that you use, you can actually add to this catalog very readily and customize this to your own needs. You can even determine which of these instance types show up on a per user basis, per group basis, and so forth. On the right-hand side, as I bring up MySQL, on the right-hand side you see the various form factors that this particular instance type is available. So we have Amazon RDS, we have OpenStack, KVM, Docker container, generic VMware, even a Vagrant, and a bare metal. So the beauty of that is that this particular instance type comes in many flavors. Now, as we go to deploy, I'm going to be asked where I want to place that. I'm going to put this in this VPC2 that I've set up, and I'm going to go ahead and give it a name of Spud Database. I'll put that as a production tag, and then we get, in this case, we have two versions available, 5.6 and 5.5. And as you can see, the form factors, I have Docker single master, Docker master slave, Docker master master. Existing is crucial. This is for brownfield, so I could go take an existing MySQL instance and actually embrace it and bring it into Morpheus. And then because of this VPC2 has both KVM and Docker footprint in it, I can deploy this as a KVM virtual machine or KVM virtual machine master slave. I'll just stick with a single master for now. I'm going to up the memory just a little bit. So the plans are fully customizable, and you can create those to match your needs and common deployment patterns. I'll just give it some credentials here if I don't mistype it. And skipping through here, I could also specify a post-provisioning workflow, which would run anything from a chef recipe to a shell script to a SSH script, PowerShell even. So post-provisioning workflow could be run here, or I could run it at any time on that instance as well. Now, here we see the power of those containers because that thing's going to be up in just a moment. In the meantime, as I said, I just previously launched that Tomcat container. And upon doing that, by the way, we immediately start gathering stats at the container level for memory storage, CPU, IOPS, network. We can see down here, down at the actual container, I can see all those as well. And we begin collecting logs from that guy, and the logging is all backed by Elasticsearch. I can see and search both on time frame, on severity, and everything else. Very, very efficient logging built in. But more, really, the key here is we're going to take these two and bring them together into an application. So I'm going to call this Spud Marketing. There, already typed for me. And just to note, I could have chosen a template here, so I could have had my common stacks already pre-configured. Tomcat MySQL is already here, in which case I'm just going to populate the data fields that were necessary. But I wanted to kind of show you the catalog and take it down a notch. That's why I went through that. But in this case, I'm going to take two running instances, SpudDB and Spud Tomcat, combine them, and now when we go to Spud Marketing, we see that we formed an application. What happened there when I created that app is it's doing all the cross-container linking, setting up all the connectivity between those two instances so they can talk to each other. I didn't have to tell it anything about the underlying infrastructure, where it was going to go. Notice that it picked up the IP addressing of that destination cloud, but I didn't have to specify any of that. More importantly, holistically at the app level now, I have consolidated logs, so we can see my MySQL logs, my Tomcat logs. I can drill down on those. Again, I could search them. In addition, monitoring, it's just started up, so it's not totally sure if it's ready yet, but a few more iterations of the tests and the checks that are happening, it will go green. But notice what it's done. It's created checks both for the web server itself via a website check, and that's actually interrogating the Tomcat tier as a web server. It's happening at a specified interval of 5 minutes by default, but you can specify that. You can even specify the criticality of this particular tier and instance, and whether it affects the overall availability of the app. Again, if you could look at there are other types of checks built in, just a generic socket, just about every database check specifically, even a message queue check looking at queue depth. And then the ability to leverage external things. So if your app relies on third-party APIs or third-party services, you can add a check against one of those to your app so that you know if the app overall is impacted by that, let's say, service out there. All right, let's go back to our app, though. Oops. We'll go back to the app itself. And I've got these two together. One thing I want to do, though, is go ahead and actually I'll start by adding some data to the database very quickly. So here it's spun up the database on this IP import, and I will simply bring up a little SQL utility to load some data in there so we have something interesting. This is a content management system, this little two-tier app backed by database, so that's what I'm going to, just for fun, rather than smoke and mirrors, we'll actually do it live. I'll go ahead and add a database. I'm going to call this Spud Marketing, and I'm going to import some data. And again, this is just a standard SQL tool that I'm using for that. All right, so while that's populating the database, I'm going to go back to the web tier. And indeed, on the Tomcat side, one important thing I want you to see as well, before you joined, I did a deployment, and that simply allowed me to select my options. In this case, it's Tomcat, so I have my Catalina options here. And then I simply did a drag and drop of my WAR file and push it up there. I could have done a fetch, and for other types of deployments, I could have actually pointed at my GitHub and done a fork and done a build of that directly from within the deploy function. What I'm going to do now, though, is look at the environment tab. And here we can see that we have all the local environment variables for Tomcat. And this is what helps us decouple it from the infrastructure, because I'm writing to these environment variables, not to these what are addresses picked up on the deployment itself. And then I've reciprocally exported and imported all of the other environment variables from the other stack components. In this case, I want to add one more to this, which will be the database name. I made that one configurable in this particular example, and we just created it, called it Spud Marketing. I'll add that and save that. And because I've tweaked some environment variables and so forth, I'm going to go ahead and just bounce that Tomcat. While we're here and waiting for that to come back up, let's talk about scale for just a moment. If I wanted to, I could have, I did actually, it looks like I created that already. I could have pointed at my software load balancer or a hardware load balancer, F5, A10, etc. And I can choose to then auto upscale or downscale this particular web tier based on a variety of parameters, as you'd expect. And I can even do that on a schedule. So if I know ahead of time that a particular day of week, day of month, etc. is going to be busy, I can scale things up and then scale them down afterwards. And that's all elegant and built-in, tied into that load balancer. So if I go now, here's that load balancer report. In this case, I'm using our inbuilt HA proxy, but it could, like I said, be external. And then there's the actual Tomcat. Pull him up. We have our nice CMS brought up here. And I can easily go in here now and scale that Tomcat tier, scale it into that any cloud I have access to from where I am, add one more to that, and now I have both of them. And as you can see down below, if I go to the Summary tab, we've instantiated a second instance that knows to place that on a different part of the infrastructure. For architecture, I don't want to put it on the same host. I'm not really buying anything if I do that. And it'll be up there in a moment and load balancing across those. Similarly, if I want to scale the database tier, I can do that as well. I can come in here and say, okay, let's add another slave. You'll notice there's no scaling, auto scale on the database tier. It's easy to do for a web server. It's quite a bit trickier to do for a database. Scaling up is actually easy. It's scaling down that gets tricky. So for scaling there, we're just going to add another node. And when I perform that, I added that slave, you can see there's the primary master there, and there's the slave just being deployed. And when it's completed, it's going to be populated with all the data and so forth, be synchronizing as the database should. Again, we've talked briefly about logs. We've talked briefly about monitoring. Again, on the database tier, notice that I have a master and a slave. They both end up having a check now, and those checks are MySQL checks. Interrogating the database as a database and passing that information up to the alerting piece. Let's go back to the app, though. Again, I want to talk about backups for just a moment. Those are also integrated and automatic. And the reason they're important is, again, some folks feel that web scale and backups are sort of at odds with each other. Web scale should be about disposable infrastructure. The reality is, if I've deployed just a simple web server and it goes away, it's much easier for me to actually deploy a backup of that, redeploy a backup, than deploy an empty web server and then have to push the content back out to it. So from our standpoint, backups are essential, and they yield tremendous benefit when it comes to things like mobility, because I can now move a workload from one cloud to another because I have backups available to make that transition happen. And again, this one, I've got my backups already going. I can see what they are. In fact, I'll force one here just to show you. And that'll kick off here, and I'll see I've got one already in progress, and then I'll have another one coming up. Also under actions, I can start and stop at the service level, so bounce just the actual service. I could actually resize it from here, clone it, run a workflow against it, the same workflows that I had. So with that, I want to turn for a moment to the admin tab and talk about some of these integrations. As I mentioned, this built-in logging is terrific, but many customers have found and identified tools they'd like to use to solve the same problem. So you might have a Splunk integration out there, a Splunk deployment in place already. We can happily tie into that as well. Same thing with Logarithm. Likewise, on the monitoring front, Our built-in checks are there, but you could also use App Dynamics or ServiceNow, New Relic, and then similarly backups, same kind of theme repeating. Our built-in backups are terrific, but if you're a fan of Veeam or you're using Commvault, those integrations exist. And I think that speaks to the broader architecture, which is one of make sure that it's there, period, right? We need to have logging and monitoring as a holistic part of the application. It's part and parcel of the app. But if you have other tools to do it, so be it. We can defer to those as well. Also from the admin tab, a good place to point out that we can tie into existing work that you've already got in place around, let's say, your Chef recipes or Puppet or even your own Docker repo with your own containers. We can tie into that existing body of work and leverage that as you'd expect. In fact, on the provisioning side, I mentioned it briefly, but when it comes to that catalog, if you don't have something in the catalog that you would like, you can upload your own VMs here, your own virtual images, and then turn them into library catalog items, if you will. Give them a custom icon, give them a category, give them a name, and then once there, you can drop in, let's say, pick something fun here, future database. And within here, then add each form factor, each version, and where you want that to live. So if it's an Azure component that you're putting in there, you could tie that in right here. If it's let's say it's a Docker container, etc. And these then end up with as selections in that instance catalog when you pull it up. All right, let's see. We're about half past. Let's move back to our flow here for the demo just to make sure we're on track. So again, we've provisioned both the database and web front end. We linked those two to form an application. We deployed those out to a cloud, and then we looked at the ability to monitor very briefly and the ability to monitor both the logs and the application itself. And we took a brief look at backups. If I come back to the app itself, now that we've had a few cycles running, we can see on the monitoring side, availability isn't quite up yet, probably because I created that MySQL slave. So, but this will go to green, and this will go to a response time for us. And upon failure of these, if we have anything happen vis-a-vis an incident, we'll get that noted here. We can set up our contacts within Morpheus, and then alert rules are very, very discrete. So I could come in here and say, okay, here's a new rule. I want it if things go critical for a specified period of time, so I want to avoid any overreaction, for example. And then I can filter on at the app level. I could filter at the actual the checks themselves that were created for the app, or I could even look at individual groups. So I could do it by a particular place that I'm doing this. Let's say those guys. And then upon doing so, where do I want that information to go? And that could go to a person. It could tie into Slack, all sorts of places we can send those notifications. Again, back on logs, I mentioned it, but a very robust logging interface, the ability to pop in here and query by, let's say I want to just look by severity level, by schedule, by text, whatever, free form, very robust. We find a lot of customers are just blown away by this alone. This alone has been the driver of a number of Morpheus deployments because everyone's struggling for a way to comprehensively bring all their logs together. And as you can see, if I come back out here, as you can see, I've got all of the logs at an app level, including various instance types. So both of my MySQL databases, both of my Tomcats, all showing up in one place. All right, with that, Dave, anything that I've missed? You're the architect and engineering guru behind a number of the concepts here. I'm sure I've missed something in my quest to be as quick as possible, so we leave time for Q&A. But what have I missed?
I think that pretty much is a good coverage of the basics of Morpheus.
Awesome. All right. Well, with that, then we have a minute before I switch it over to Q&A. So let me talk briefly about reporting. So I can look at utilization and capacity. I can even pop into analytics. I could say, let's look at my various clouds. I don't have anything going on these other clouds at the moment. I could then drill down on a particular cloud and actually compare that with other options that are out there. So here's my Morpheus cloud. Remember, this is a Linux-based KVM Docker setup, essentially. I can compare that against my other cloud options, my Amazon, my vCloud Air, SoftLayer, Azure. In this case, I haven't actually done any cost attribution in the service plan, but I can assign not only a cost, but also a price. So there's my cost internally on the IT side, if you will, or whoever's providing this. And then there's the price that would be consumed by the business unit or the dev team. And those could be the same. They could have an uplift to cover overhead, what have you. But those, once populated, those would provide more interesting looking reports, certainly. Take a moment and talk about that roles-based access. Again, at the role level, very discrete access, read, write, or none. So I can actually, in some cases, eliminate entire options from the GUI so that they're not, people aren't curious what that is or confused by too many options. I can dramatically simplify the user interface and the user experience, and then I can delineate what cloud resources they have access to, even what instance types they have access to as well. And I can do an arbitrary sort of collection of roles and users in that manner very easily. It's also important to note that Morpheus was built to be multi-tenant, as well as potentially white labeled for service provider type environments where maybe you want to brand it internally and then provide this to a number of subtenants and have those all controlled by the same super serve account, but have separation down at the multi-tenant level. That's all very much architecturally part of Morpheus and easy to manage. So with that, I think, why don't we open up for questions and discussion. Did we get a poll response? I'm just curious to see if we
actually
what the results were on the poll.
We just pumping up the poll now. So basically, we want to get an idea of where your apps are living now. Are they on bare metal, hypervisor virtual machines, containers, or other? I don't know what the other may be. But if you can give us your answers now.
Yeah, and if you answer other, you have to tell us what that is. So,
yeah, what the other is would be interesting. So we'll close voting in about 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's see what our survey says. Well, I think that's probably to be expected.
Yeah, I think I'm actually surprised that the containers are catching up, right? So the pivot point is around VMs, obviously, so people are moving away from bare metal and moving toward something else, and we see that shift. So the beauty is we don't care, right? Morpheus was constructed so that whether it's bare metal or a virtual machine or containers, we treat them all identically, right? We really don't care what those are. So we're going to back them up the same way. We're going to maintain them the same way. We're going to log them the same way. Really, it becomes a matter of efficiency and maybe density and speed. So if I'm a developer, I want to live here, and I can spin up my environment in no time at all. That same stack of components as containers are quite elegant to bring up and down. It may be in production, though, for whatever reason I choose to do them as virtual machines. I don't want to have a different interface to those two worlds, right? I don't want to have to treat things differently to achieve that. So therein lies some of the, yeah, go ahead.
Andrew, I was going to say what might be an interesting metric here, and I just saw it borne out in a recent survey we did that we'll be publishing, as well as some other recent research, is the amount of people who are running containers in virtual machines. Right? So
yeah, that one's an interesting one. Yeah. Yeah, it's their way to transition to that at some point, right?
Well, is it a transitional phase, or is it maybe something we didn't expect, that people would, they run both forever. I mean, that they use sort of a virtual machine cloud with containers running on top of the hypervisors. I don't know.
Yeah, that's
It'll be
actually very
interesting.
common, and part of that is there are a lot of, I mean, most cloud providers are still all virtual machine based and haven't entirely
Yep.
made the move to actually doing container-based architecture. There are a few out there that I'm aware of that are 100% container services on bare metal, where you can spin up containers on bare metal, but not very many. Most of them are all still VM hypervisors. So that's probably why you get that as a primary use case. The other thing is commonly people still run their databases as VMs or services like on RDS with containers as their ephemeral horizontal scaling type web tiers. One big reason for that is most cases, most of these ECS or Docker containers, the data is 100% ephemeral. There's no persistent storage. That is one difference with Morpheus, is that we actually create logical volumes for every container we build up. So all your data is clonable, movable, persistent, even on restarts.
Got it. Let me give a couple of other questions here for David and Andrew. One is, does Morpheus support NoSQL databases such as Mongo or Cassandra in a PaaS offering?
Yes, it does. As a matter of fact, the really nice one is Mongo. Mongo is a really good example because we can even provision full sharded replica sets of Mongo. It actually requires 7 instances to do, because once you tie in all the config servers, the replicas, the arbiters, Mongo is kind of a beast to set up out of the gate for a sharded cluster, but it automatically does all that for you.
Excellent. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Am I paused or am I showing? Let's see here.
I see your screen.
There we go. Yeah, so I just pulled up the catalog to that end. So within the catalog, I can look at all instance types. I can look at SQL, NoSQL. So Cassandra, Elasticsearch, Mongo, Rethink, RYAC, and so are all available.
Great. Our next question is Morpheus integrated with log analysis tools such as Splunk?
Sure. So I'll reiterate on that. Let me just move this panel out of the way so I can see where I am. So yes, again, the objective here is to provide logging sort of out of the box because we think it's essential, right? It's sort of not an option. You have to have it if you're going to try and log these things. But yes, in the case where you're using Splunk, we have Splunk integration built in. So you can enable this as well and just hand off all of this logging directly to Splunk. And we're logging at the container level, at the VM, the container, the app, across the board. So we have all of those logs, and we can hand those northbound to anything else, be it just generically syslog or specific integrations with Logarithm and Splunk today. I will tell you, when I started at Morpheus, I was previously at Cisco for about 17 years on the infrastructure side. I've only been over here about 4 months, but I will tell you, none of these integrations were even in the interface when I started. So architecturally, the team has done an exceptional job of building out an extensible platform where they can plug in these additional tool sets. The same thing with monitoring, right? AppD, ServiceNow, New Relic were not part of the integration when I began just 4 months ago. So just terrific. It speaks to the architecture, speaks to the agility, and speaks to the benefits of DevOps, right? If you do it correctly, you can really add tremendous value and capabilities in just very little time at all.
Excellent. Guys, I didn't, let me just see. No, I don't, oh, here's another one. Would you recommend Morpheus as a PaaS solution in a hybrid cloud model?
Absolutely. Yeah, no question about it.
That was what I was waiting for. Okay. Guys, I don't see any other questions from the audience, but I wanted to, for those who, I don't know if we have a slide with it, Andrew and David, or not, but how can people get more information here?
Sure, you bet. Let me pause this very quickly. Just fly back up here. So the easiest way is just come to our website, and you can request a demo there, morpheusdata.com, or you can contact either myself or Dave directly as well. But easiest way is probably just go to morpheusdata.com. You'll find lots of content up there. We've got a number of video tutorials called Morpheus Minutes that go in the time frame of a minute or two. They go through specific bits of functionality kind of a quick little revisit of things, and there's close to 40 of those out there. We've got customer information out there, and you can request a live demo. We're happy to go back through this with anyone that is interested.
Okay, just two other quick things just came in. Number one, yes, the recording of this webinar will be available on DevOps.com and YouTube, as well as a copy of the slides, and as all of our webinars are, so I'll answer that. Secondly, back at you, Andrew and David, is can Morpheus deploy custom software and manage state for the service?
I'm not sure if I understand that question. Go ahead, Dave.
I don't know what, I mean, that's kind of a broad question there.
Yeah.
But yes, it can maintain state for services and deploy other services. Another cool thing that Morpheus does do as well is it does support native Chef integration. So if you have a Chef server and you want to actually bootstrap your services, you can use that as well.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Guys, I know we said that was the end of the questions, but they came in. Let me at least try to answer.
That's fine. We have plenty of time.
Yeah, we have time. How about infra monitoring? Does Morpheus provide a solution for that? I'm not sure of infra monitoring.
Infrastructure monitoring, I think.
Infrastructure monitoring. Okay.
Yes, it does. So there's a couple different ways it does that and accomplishes that, depending. I mean, if you're in bare metal, there's a Morpheus agent. I mean, it's no different than Amazon having its VM tools that it installs on its hosts, things like that. So we can monitor at the guest OS level all your infrastructure, all the stats, as well as we can monitor that information at the hypervisor level.
Yeah, so here I pulled up one of our nodes, one of our Morpheus nodes out there, and here are all of the server and OS logs, for example, being made available right here.
Right. And we do keep track of common things like disk usage and things like that as well, and are capable of alerting you if those things reach thresholds.
Yeah, and one other thing I didn't mention, but we have time, and I did condense things to try to keep it into a 1 hour start to finish, but since we have a couple minutes, this is a crucial one. So, and I might even have Dave speak to this a little bit, but the ability to then migrate between one environment and another is crucial. It's something that is increasingly interesting to our customers and folks interested in platforms. We have three ways currently to migrate a workload, so hypervisor to hypervisor. I'm going to let Dave, actually, he's the brains behind all of these. So Dave, do you want to just speak to these real quick?
Yeah, sure. So we actually support several different ways of migration. Hypervisor to hypervisor is a pretty common one. We actually have built-in support for doing virtual image conversion and snapshotting in Morpheus. We can do that using the common QEMU image tool, so we can do almost any basically virtual image disk format and move that, multi-disk or single disk. We also do have building out support for streamable image conversion, meaning we can actually convert that image on the fly as we transfer it to your destination hypervisor. Pretty useful. The other two options are less common situations. They're typically when you can't extract a snapshot or don't have access to a hypervisor. We provide some alternate means for extracting a virtual image compatible file. In some cases, that's a virtual image extract, mainly for Windows. Or we can do LVM snapshot streaming and store that onto a running Linux box. So several different ways to extract that data off another host. Those last two are also very common in a bare metal world where someone's trying to move something that's on bare metal into a hypervisor.
Great. We've got, I guess, telling them we had plenty of time did the trick. What is the pricing model? Andrew, that sounds like a you question.
Yeah, sure. It's quite simple, right? So there's no sort of feature nickel and dimey kind of stuff. It's very much based on overall capacity of workload under management based on RAM. So we do, the nominal pricing is $25 per gig of managed RAM per year. But we can also do ELAs, and we've done sort of for customers who don't want to have to count things like RAM or sockets or servers, we can certainly sit down and come up with a pricing model that meets your needs. The good news about being a small company is that we have the flexibility to really tailor that model toward our customers versus the opposite, right, which is here's our model and fit into it. But generally speaking, it's simply based on the overall scale that you're going to be looking at, right?
All right, here's something a little more technical. Maybe David can sink his teeth into. How would Morpheus perform SSO with a cloud provider like AWS for provisioning PaaS on an EC2 instance?
Okay. Well, I think that's kind of that's a wide topic a little bit too. So one cool thing about single sign-on features Morpheus does provide is it does have LDAP, Okta, it has Active Directory, all those types of integrations built in. You can actually see that in the admin accounts tab. You can add what's called identity sources. So from a single sign-on perspective, we do have support for features like that. Once you typically add a cloud for Amazon, you can use an IAM rule or something like that. Once you do that, that IAM rule is scoped to that cloud integration. So you can have multiple cloud integrations for Amazon, scoped to different resources, and then you can use role-based access control to restrict who can provision onto an EC2 instance or to a VPC or things like that. I hope that answers the question.
I think so. How can we interpret the logs? This goes back to our last question.
So there's several different ways to interpret the logs. We've had several people that just use the embedded logs, and you can do Lucene-based search. Everything's backed by Elasticsearch. So Morpheus is giving you basically an ELK logging stack built in on any Morpheus deployment. You can scale that out. We have some customers who even add Kibana on top or add it to their existing Kibana Elasticsearch cluster. So very robust capabilities into parsing those logs. And there's a lot more data in there as well. We actually do keep track of context. So if you're in a microservices type deployment, you can actually technically track those logs via a token as they flow through your microservice architecture.
Great.
And that's a good point, Dave. It reminds me that one thing to point out, right, Morpheus architecturally behind the scenes, you've gotten a glimpse of it, but it's built with the very same principles that we're talking about here, right? So it's it can be deployed as a single virtual appliance, but it can also be fully stretched across multiple data centers from an HA perspective. It can be disaggregated to multiple physical boxes for scale, but as is, even as a single instance, because we're in the control plane, we've already scaled to many thousands of instances on just a single sort of all-in-one controller quite readily. So architecturally, I think a nod to the underlying guts of this. It's pretty awesome.
Great. How does Morpheus differ from Cloud Foundry? That's a good question.
Oh, perfect. So I'll touch it, and I'll have Dave give even a finer point on it. So, you know, first and foremost, Cloud Foundry is 54 VMs, right? So just to get Cloud Foundry up and running, before you can actually do anything, it's 54 virtual machines. Simply put, it's a very big hammer, right? And once you get it up and running, you can deploy a few things, Redis, Rabbit, etc. And you're actually recoding your software to Cloud Foundry. This is not a sort of an agnostic, non-intrusive approach. You are Cloud Foundryfying your code if you go that Cloud Foundry route. That's terrific if you have dysfunction and can't agree on something, so you just make a vendor come in and force you to do something that maybe nobody likes, but at least you're doing something. I will tell you, I have lots of experience with Cloud Foundry, both in my current role, but in my role back at Cisco, and these things are measured in like quarters of time to deploy, and typically 2 commas in terms of services just to get it going. Morpheus can be up and running in a matter of, truthfully, 30 minutes, but let's call it a half a day. For fun, and you're actually doing stuff. You're actually chopping wood instead of spending time. I jokingly tell people to give me just one of their bi-weekly Cloud Foundry status meetings, and we can have Morpheus deployed and them deploying workloads in half of that meeting's time. So that's how they differ. I'm not trying to poke too much at Cloud Foundry, but very different approach, right? A top-down approach. I think one that's truthfully orthogonal to the spirit of DevOps, the spirit of these bring your own stack architectures, because it forces you down a path that's very much a one-way road. You cannot zig once you've gone down Cloud Foundry.
Got it. Well, guys, I think that's going to call it a wrap on today's event. To those of you who've stayed around, Thank you very much. Andrew and David, thank you for a great insight here into Morpheus and all of the things you can do with it. We look forward to having you back on again and maybe hearing more about where this is, where not only where it's headed, but where it's going. But until then, thank you very much to Morpheus for sponsoring today's webinar as well. This is Alan Schimmel for DevOps.com, and we hope to see you again on another webinar soon. Thanks, and have a great day.